wrote the book, The Naked Mind. You started by gathering knowledge deeply, and you've really, in so many ways, Annie, flipped so much of this conversation around people's relationship with alcohol on its head. And what I love, which is such a positive sort of approach to the way that you've done it. Tell me this, what is the core philosophy behind The Naked Mind? And when did you sort of pull back and say, this isn't sustainable? 2 bottles of wine a night is not sustainable. I got a problem. I've got to fix it.
So let me tell you how it's interesting, because I actually wasn't really able to articulate why it worked until the last maybe 2 years. And which is fascinating because it's worked for so many other people. But the process for me that I went through is I was actually coming back from London, and I'd been drinking late that night up to like 3 a.m. with a bunch of colleagues. And I had to get up at 6 a.m. to get on the train. And I was so hungover and I was so miserable. And I went into the hotel bar and I asked if I could have a mimosa, because that in my mind was sort of a acceptable morning drink. And the waitress said, well, I'm not going to open the bottle of champagne this early because it will go flat before any other guests. And she's like, unless you're going to drink the whole thing. And I was like, oh, no, of course not. And and so she's like, but I could give you a screwdriver, which was vodka and orange juice. And I'd never drank hard alcohol in the morning. I thought that's one of those little lines that if I don't cross that line, then I'm surely not, an alcoholic. But I was super desperate. I just wanted to feel better. So I had like 2 or 3 of those. And I remember getting to the airport and feeling so miserable. I had this pit in my stomach. I started crying. I had my journal out, and I was just writing like, I definitely have a problem. And it was a question, like I had told myself that and been trying to get myself to admit to this problem for probably 3-4 years now at this point, taking breaks. And I'd get to this point of pain. I admit to this problem. I'd make myself these promises that I wasn't going to drink anymore. I was going to drink less. Then I'd break the promises. And I was in this shame cycle where I couldn't even look in the mirror. I felt so loathing of myself. How can I be smart and in control in every other area of my life? But this is this strange and painful exception. And it was in that moment of, again, asking myself those same questions. Do I have a problem? Am I an alcoholic? What is wrong with me? That just kind of in this like very, I would almost say like spiritual moment, I had this other question, which was why? Why did I used to be able to take it or leave it? Why is alcohol now, so important to everything when I didn't even drink for, into my adult years? And I made a commitment to myself in that moment that I gave myself a year, and I was like, I'm going to stop trying to stop drinking, and I'm going to answer why. And I made a list of every single reason I drank. And we live in this amazing day and age where you can literally just download scientific studies off the internet, read them, understand. And I went through literally every reason, all about what alcohol is and does in the brain, what it does neurologically, why we use it to fit into society, how it's marketed. And through this process, I literally lost my desire to drink. And without desire, there's no temptation.
How is someone supposed to know if they have a problem?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating because the term alcoholic is not actually scientifically or medically used. It's just part of our kind of cultural common knowledge, but there isn't a definition for it. So when you would go into your doctor and say like, am I an alcoholic? They would say, only you can know. Mm-hmm. But now we've evolved past that, thankfully, a little bit. And now there is an 11 question alcohol use disorder. But the amazing thing about the alcohol use disorder 11 questions is if you answer 2 yes, you have alcohol use disorder. And so 2 of those questions are, do you ever need to drink more than you used to get the same effect? So have you built any sort of tolerance? Every drinker I know would say yes. Or have you ever had a bout of drinking where you feel like you overdid it or you drank too much? Again, every drinker I know would say yes. So by that definition, this isn't a question or a conversation for some fringe part of the population that are alcoholics. It's an everyone conversation. And so if we can just like sort of put that term, that shaming label aside, it's such a barrier to change. Because if you have to admit to being an alcoholic to change, you're going to put off that admission for as long as possible because it's literally defined in our minds as a life sentence and you have to go to meetings for the rest of your life. And by the way, you're not going to be able to socialize how you used to. You're going to be outside of everything. Nothing will be fun, and you'll basically be miserable. So, like, we're not going to admit that to ourselves until something really bad happens. So, by definition, it really perpetuates this rock bottom experience, which isn't necessary. A big part of my journey was that I never reached any proverbial rock bottoms. I certainly had emotional experiences that were like, oh, but I didn't wreck my car. I didn't lose my job. And I feel like if we can back up this conversation to where people aren't asking, am I an alcoholic? They're simply asking, would I be happier drinking a bit less? Or would I be happier, maybe drinking nothing at all?
Is there a genetic component to all of this from an addiction perspective?
So there certainly are genetic components, and it's a fascinating conversation because they have yet to be able to say, okay, you have, and with all the advances in sort of medicine and mapping genetics, you really would think that we would be at a point where we could say, okay, you have these genes, therefore you should be more cautious. We've never gotten to that point. The fascinating thing about it is it's usually the same sort of genetic aspects that also create ADHD, that also create, which is interesting because most entrepreneurs have ADHD. A lot of intense athletes or Navy SEALs also have these genetic components because the things that the genes are doing, it's not necessarily that there's a gene that's saying, hey, you drink alcohol. There's a gene that's saying maybe you have a lower dopamine sensitivity. So it takes more activity or more adrenaline or more adventure or more alcohol to get the same dopamine response as another person. So a lot of these genetic components are things that can be superpowers, the ability to want to try new things, to be a risk taker, but they can also lead to addiction. So it's a really fascinating conversation. I think one of the things that is commonly sort of known is that when a child grows up in an alcoholic household and they are more likely to overdrink or to fall into addiction. And that's pretty clear, but they haven't been really clear on why that is genetically. And I think the interesting aspect of that is that it makes a lot more sense to me personally, and this is my own theory, that alcohol numbs the brain. It makes it so your neurons fire slower. It takes you out of pain. In fact, they used to use it way back in the day for surgeries before we had safer alternatives for anesthetic.
Wow.
And so when you are in a household that is unstable, that feels unsafe, that you never know which version of your parent you are going to get, and you are drenched in this trauma and anxiety of that instability, and you have your first drink and it feels like peace for the first time in your life, the likelihood of you continuing to use that tool to self-medicate is very high. And I think it's just simple that way. It's not necessarily genetic. It's just that if we are in trauma or in pain, and Dr. Gabor Mate has done some brilliant research on the links between heavy addiction and trauma, and they absolutely are there. But it's because these substances help us escape. They help us manage. And while my work admittedly is much more focused on kind of the every person who's just over drinking and maybe in corporate, we all do have various forms of trauma, of upset, of discontent. And anytime we're using the substance to self-medicate, it can, become problematic.
So what are those 4 things that you wish you knew when you were a kid and that you think is great for us to share with young people before they ever have their first drink?
Oh, yeah. So the first one is the fact that actually dopamine, we get really confused about the chemical dopamine. So we think that dopamine is the happy or liking molecule. And dopamine is interesting because it starts like that, but it's actually really the wanting molecule. And so what this means very specifically, and how I explain it to kids in the book is through video games, they've all had the experience or candy, eating way too much candy, and then the candy stops tasting good. Or they're playing video games and it's so much fun, and then 4 or 6 hours later, video games are making them miserable. And that's because what's happening is that in the body, the dopamine is encouraging you. It's saying, hey, that thing you just did, do that thing again. And actually that thing you just did, that thing is necessary for your survival. So dopamine shows up when we're doing something like a first-person shooter video game because we used to have to target practice or, hunt and kill for our survival. Or candy because food and sugar, right? Now, substances like alcohol, they artificially stimulate that dopamine. So it's saying in the brain, as soon as you have your first drink, it's saying, do that thing you just did again, and you need to do it in order to survive. But the thing is, it's not making you like it anymore. So you're going to like it a little bit, but then over time, that liking of it goes down and down and down. But the wanting of it, because that dopamine molecule is heavily at work, is going up and up and up. And so just like a video game that makes you feel really miserable after too much of it, or like too much candy, alcohol is artificially stimulating that dopamine. It's at artificially high levels. And so it's getting you to want to do something well after you like doing it. And that's why, they can see adults who drink until they're sick, or, drink until they're massively hungover. It's because of that dopamine response. So that's number one. Number two is fascinating. What happens in the brain is actually alcohol numbs our ability to experience joy. And so it does that in this somewhat complicated way, but what basically happens is that we build up a tolerance for joy. So as we drink, certain things are released in the brain. And in order to combat those overly excited or overly happy feelings of euphoria, the process of tolerance or purging is the brain releases a counterchemical called dynorphin. I like to remember dynorphin because it sounds like endorphin, but it's kind of its evil twin. Now, dynorphin actually brings down the pleasure center in the brain. The body will purge alcohol relatively quickly, but you are left with this residual dynorphin levels in the brain, which bring down the pleasure. So it used to be that if you were doing something like that, dynorphin can stay in your body for 24 to 48 hours. So if you drink regularly, something that you used to like to do without a drink, you no longer like to do without a drink. And we know that this is true because we used to love to just go to a sporting event when we were kids. But then all of a sudden, we need the beers to be able to enjoy it. Or we used to love going out to dinner, but all of a sudden we need the glass of wine. And so what happens over time is that we are breaking through that counterchemical that's actually dampening our joy and pleasure. And what happens is that we lose our ability to experience pleasure with the little things, like maybe just a meal doesn't feel as good anymore, or a walk with a friend doesn't feel as good anymore, because we have this ever-present level of dynorphin, which is that counterchemical to happiness. The third thing is really what we talked about before, that idea of that unfair trade, that you get 20 minutes of a buzz for 2 to 3 hours of a downer. And that's such a big eye-opener for kids. And then the fourth thing is just really that this journey is so slippery. And I really talk about this metaphor of a pitcher plant, which was originated by Alan Carr. And it's this idea that the pitcher plant is this kind of carnivorous plant, but when a bee goes into it, it's sipping on this really sweet nectar, it's enjoying it, but what it doesn't realize is it's slipping very slowly down into the plant. And once it slips down in there and it looks around, it's like, it's okay, I want one more sip, I want one more sip. And this is all things that happen chemically in the brain to get us to want one more drink, no big deal. I'll fix this later, I'll deal with this later. So as we see things getting worse, as we see ourselves slipping further and further down into the plant, we still think, oh, but I can escape. I have wings, no big deal. I can put this down. And I remember this from my own experience. I really thought, like, I can put this down at any time. I can just stop at any time. And what we don't realize is that as we get further and further, that's getting stickier and stickier. And in the pitcher plant, an example, it gets kind of morbid, but I think it's very powerful and it's all illustrated. But in the pitcher plant example, the juice, the nectar, is actually created from the bodies of all the other bugs that have been trapped by the plant.
Wow.
And so you're looking around and you're realizing that this thing that you thought was so life-giving and connected you with your friends and made things more fun is actually really just kind of this nectar of death, and it's stealing life from you. So it's a little lighter than that in the kids' book, but it's that basic premise that it's a real slippery slope.